Welcome to the Solar Investors Guide podcast, published by Photovoltaic Magazine and PV Europe. The number of cyber attacks on solar power systems is on the rise. This is not only annoying for operators who suffer revenue losses or have to pay ransom, but also poses a security risk to our power supply. Once hacked systems are networked, or if many of them are hacked at the same time, they can become a threat to the stability of our electricity supply. Fortunately, it is not that difficult to protect solar systems, and especially inverters, from cyber attacks. Often, simple negligence is what makes systems vulnerable. I spoke with Uri Sadot, Cybersecurity Program Director at SolarEdge and Chair of the Digitalization Workstream at Solar Power Europe, about how to protect solar systems from cyber attacks and why it is absolutely essential to do so. My name is Carsten Schäfer. Hi Uri, welcome to the Solar Investors Guide podcast.
Thank you, Carsten. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are the Cybersecurity Program Director at SolarEdge. What do you do as such?
What do I do? Well, it's a bit confusing because most companies have CISOs that are responsible for protecting their own corporate network. And in our company, we have that, and also a director of product security that's in charge of the actual security of the products. What I do is somewhere in between. I do a lot of external engagement with customers, with regulators, and other parties that are involved. Security researchers is one example. Really trying to push forward the topic of calling for a more secure, cyber secure power infrastructure.
And is this a common position nowadays in companies like yours, or are you at the forefront?
I think I'm the only one, but that's not an accurate way to put it. I have colleagues, or I would say peers, in many of the companies in the industry. It's just organized differently. Sometimes it's a product manager, sometimes it would be somebody on the regulatory department, but I'm kind of a hybrid version that's doing some of the interdisciplinary work.
I see. All right. You are also chair of Solar Power Europe's digitalization workstream. What do you do in this role?
Right. So very early on, when I started promoting this issue, we started engaging with Solar Power Europe. Solar Power Europe is a very veteran industry association. It's the largest industry association in Europe for solar. And it's been around for almost 40 years. They just celebrated their 40th. And they have a great standing with the EU bodies, the different agencies, the EU Commission. So two great things happened from my perspective in Solar Power Europe. The first was that it was a terrific platform to have a cross-industry discussion. So we had companies, competitors, and companies across the value chain discuss these issues and the importance of cybersecurity being introduced in early stages of design for solar products. And the second great benefit is just the amazing access and respect that they have with regulatory bodies. So we found ourselves having very factual, very professional discussions with regulators that are understanding of the importance of cyber for renewable energy, but oftentimes lack some of the technical expertise of how the architectures are actually built, on the vendor side or the VPP side. So that's why the dialogue was very fruitful, helping to not just create regulation that is burdensome, but regulation that is tailor-made, is very accurate to reduce the risks while putting as minimum or as little as possible hindrances to industry. Because we always say the cure can't be more hurtful than the disease, right? Like, yes, there's an issue, and we need to secure these technologies, but not in a way that would stop the market, because then what's the point?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we'll dive into these regulation later on, but right now, I read an interview of yours on the website of Solar Power Europe, where you said, quote, "The solar revolution brings not only clean energy, but also energy that is digital and connected." How can energy be digital?
Right. So One example you can think of is electric cars, right? People say that a Tesla is like a computer on wheels. It's like an iPhone in a car. Um, but really, there's no reason not to put computation in any car, right? In a gas-powered car. But what happened in reality was that the new entrants, the new companies that started building electric vehicles, they just said, okay, let's clear the planning board and build it anew. And then they build everything much more digital, and everything is much more connected. And the same thing happened with renewables. I mean, there's no reason not to build. Let's say, there's an EV charger and there's a gas pump in a gas station. Both can be digitally controlled. But historically, gas pumps have been built completely analog, right? They pump water, they pump the gas, and it's measured with all kinds of basic means. But when these new technologies, EV chargers, PV inverters, home batteries, were created, including SolarEdge's product, they were designed, cloud native, cloud first. So when you buy a solar inverter today, it's controllable from your phone. You get full data, you get control. The installers can do a lot of the work from their phones. So we have this new infrastructure that's being built, and this is growing chunks of the energy generation, energy storage capability in Europe, and growing, that has just been, quote, born digital and born in the internet. So for that reason, it allows for great new potential of flexibility, and you can trade energy, and you can adjust to pricing according to short intervals, and you can make a much, much, much more efficient grid. And by the way, a much more secure and resilient grid that can break off into islands, and every home can be a microgrid. So the technology allows for that, but we have to make sure that the security is there, because any smart connectivity that's not secure can be misused by a malicious party. So what I mean by a digital connected grid is that when you look at the numbers in Europe today, there's just more and more and more power coming from renewable systems. And I'm completely setting aside the fact that it's clean energy or not clean energy. It's remote connected, internet connected, digitally measured, right? Every kilowatt, every watt produced is logged and sent to the cloud for monitoring. So we're in a new era where the grid is being rebuilt, essentially, or big parts of it, in a way that's digital and internet connected.
Mm-hmm. And so, with the rise of PV systems, there's only that's the reason why cybersecurity is becoming an issue.
In a way, because again, you can create a digital system with all the right locks and all the right security, or you can create it with no locks and open doors. And one way to understand that is I like to wave my phone when I give this example, but we all use online banking apps, right? And this is completely digital technology. There's something on our phone that we trust that communicates with a bank server somewhere. And this allows us to manage our savings. I can send you funds on PayPal or Venmo or whatever. So we have technologies that we can trust that are completely digital. Then again, you can also completely ignore cybersecurity and then put inverters with easy to guess passwords that you don't change and have them accessible from the internet. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of that mentality, which is oftentimes like a low cost mentality. If I'm not regulated, I will do the bare minimum. But increasingly, there's an understanding that you cannot build critical infrastructure like the power supply system of a continent based on no standards. I mean, you can do it when you're 0.5% because you're insignificant, but solar is going 5, 10, 20% with very optimistic horizons in terms of the overall generation. And when you are the grid, when you are the primary generator, you can't have a low cost mentality. You have to have clear minimal baselines on what should be the digital security levels that you require from anyone participating in this market.
Mm-hmm. All right. What major and well-known attacks on PV systems have already occurred?
Okay, so there were some. First category of attacks, it's not really attacks, but it's proofs of concept. And there have been a number of security researchers, so cyber companies that want to show how vulnerable systems are. These are oftentimes called white hat hackers or ethical hackers. And there's a report that came out last year, and a new version just came out by DER Security. It's a security company specializing in renewables. And they just show the graph, which is going up. I think last year there was something like 60 or 70 proofs of concept found. And this year we're halfway through and we're already passing that number. So we're seeing more and more and more of these proofs of concept. Now, if you want to talk about real world attacks, because the rule of thumb is that most attacks go unheard of. Companies don't have an interest to report them unless they have to, and if they can close it inside or pay the ransom or anything like that. So whenever we do see, in any industry, by the way, a reported cyber attack, it's typically the tip of an iceberg of what's happening beneath the surface. But we have seen a few real-world examples. So one of them was in Lithuania, mid last year. There's a cybersecurity company called Cyble that published a report that can be found on the internet of basically how they say it's a Russian-affiliated cyber gang went through a PV system and took networks, held it for ransom. I don't know if they took the power system ransom or the internal network of that company, but they got into military academies and hospitals and took them ransom. And the Lithuanian, one of the energy companies, Litgrid, had to manage this incident, and they reported it. Another example happened in Japan, where a botnet of IoT devices captured a lot of Contact devices. It's a brand not very familiar here, but that's still ongoing. Like, those devices are still compromised because apparently there's a difficulty updating them. And there have been a few others that I can mention, but the short version is that we're starting to see an uptick, especially in proofs of concept, but also in real world attacks. Yeah, the third one was in Denmark. There was a big attack 2 years ago where firewalls were somehow breached. There was a vulnerability found in firewalls, and the report said dozens of solar plants were compromised in Denmark. And ever since that happened, I keep seeing people in Denmark, whenever I go to conferences, try to better understand how to protect against these things.
What kind of damages can result from such attacks, apart from lost revenue from electricity sales or missed feed-in tariffs?
Right. So a lot of things could happen, right? From, if you're an asset owner or an investor, the immediate thing is downtime, right? And I've heard stories that weren't reports, but again, in conferences, sometimes you hear stories as part of the Russian-Ukraine war. A lot of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine was targeted both by rockets and missiles, but also by cyber attacks. So I heard a story about a security camera that was open to the internet that was plugged in to a solar site. And somehow through that, attackers got in and they wiped the entire system. So, they installed bad firmware and they just destroyed the devices. So this was a case of vandalism. But the same approach could be used by ransomware gangs to lock those devices and say, hey, give me a Bitcoin or I will destroy your systems. And we see those types of attacks happen all the time in other sectors. And it's only a question of time, typically, until rootkits and toolkits that are traded among cyber gangs are developed that can do this. So that's number one. If you're like a power generation industry player, an asset owner or an O&M company or whomever. A second thing that can happen if you're in a CNI segment, so if you're a company, a retail store or something like that has a PPA or has something on the roof, so the energy supply could be damaged, which is business continuity. But also sometimes if the equipment is connected to the internal network, which oftentimes it is, they can move laterally into the internal network of the company. So there's a very famous hack that is published against Target, the American retail store, from 2014. This became like the poster child of those types of attacks, where they had across their stores, they had an HVAC, so like a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning supplier. So it's a lot like monitoring for a PV plant, but for their air conditioning systems in the stores, they had a third-party remote monitoring dashboard. So through that, there was an entry into the financial network, and they managed to steal credit cards of like millions of customers. And there was a class action lawsuit against Target, and Target sued the HVAC company, and everybody sued everybody. And this was in the hundreds of millions of indemnity. So this was a very big event. And this is like 2014. So we've had a decade of other similar examples. So if you are a CNI customer, you definitely have an interest of protecting your network. And there's many ways to do that, by the way. Like most of the attacks happen where there aren't the basic hygiene. But those are a few examples. And there's also things that have been demonstrated that could attack homeowners that have a solar system. Anything from physical denial of service to even some more dangerous things that they could do with the power that's stored in these systems. And also maybe data collection, right? To see pattern of life if they get onto your meter and if they see how much energy consumption. So theoretically, there's ways to know all kinds of things about you. But sticking to the basics, in the world of cyber, there's a lot of things that could happen. State against state attacks, take out the power supply and all these scary things. But in reality, what we see most common is criminal motivation, because there's all these groups that just want to make an honest living, right? And they will typically do ransom. And the places where we think that is most likely is data theft from CNI, and in downtime and ransom type attacks against larger plants, ground mount plants.
All right. How were these attacks carried out? I mean, what are the gateways? Which components of solar systems are being attacked?
Yeah. So again, it's let's start with solar fields, right? Like a typical, I don't know, 1, 5, 10, 20 megawatt solar plant, ground mount with fences and cameras and an O&M company that's managing it. Let's start with that scenario because it's very different from, let's say, a home or a business that has a solar system. But if you take one of those solar fields, right? So in some cases, there's no regulation at all, and there's no care for cyber at all. So in those cases, you would see everything open to the internet. You would see the SCADA controllers. You would see the EMS that manages the batteries, if there's batteries. You would see the PV monitoring company. Well, a better example would be, trackers. A lot of these third parties would connect to the equipment in the site and either move things around, operate cleaning robots, and everything would be open. And if that's the case, and there's all these channels to the internet, every one of those can be a path in. That's the bad or lack of cyber hygiene scenario. A better scenario, and the bigger or the larger this capacity of the field is, the higher the chance it's regulated. So if you take a 100 megawatt solar plant, it's almost always regulated in some way by the interconnection requirement from the distribution company, or from the insurance or the financing partner of the asset. But somebody will want to mitigate the risk, and they will have that in place. So you would see in those cases that there's a firewall that ideally is maintained and patched accordingly. Behind that firewall, there's a DMZ, which is like this middle ground where the communication is controlled and logged. And then behind it,
what does that mean?
So DMZ is like it's a demilitarized zone. I guess that's the origin. Okay. Yeah, but it's a standard. You can read about the Purdue model. It's a topology for a network for an OT site or a plant or PV power plant, which is more secure, and it's also can be found in a standard called IEC 62443, which really defines how this should happen. And I guess one way to think about it is that you have the gates to the castle, right? This is the firewall. It's always kept up to date and make sure that it's secured. It only lets whoever is allowed to in. And somebody manages it, and they say, okay, this company, you get this type of access. So that's the gate. That's the firewall. Behind that, you can imagine, I don't know, like before the castle entrance, there's this area where nothing's supposed to happen. There's not a lot of activity, but there's some monitoring and some relay of communication. So that's the DMZ. And then you get into the actual perimeter, the OT perimeter. And in that network is where everything happens. So the devices communicate, the power stations, the BMS.
OT is operating technology,
exactly.
right?
The world, I mean, there's operational technology and information technology. So IT and OT. By the way, the definitions are really merging in recent years, but that's maybe another topic. But going back, so yes, you would have the OT network where you have these industrial devices, big batteries, big inverters, trackers, weather stations, everything that you can find within a solar plant. And the ways to get into a well-protected site are far fewer, right? So you can't go in through anywhere. You have to somehow go in. So let's say there's somebody who's approved to go in and it's been compromised, so that's one way. Another is if somebody within the perimeter connected something to the internet that they weren't supposed to, like a phone charger or a security camera. Or we've seen reports about devices that come in with undocumented modems. So that would be another way to, through the 5G or the cellular network, to have another channel into that OT network. So there could be all kinds of ways to breach the walls of the castle, but a site that is well maintained should not have to suffer for any of those. We even see that in some of the larger sites, there's systems deployed that analyze traffic, the network traffic inside, so that if anything fishy happens, they pick up on it and they block it, and they only allow certain commands to go through. So I guess to summarize, there's various kinds of attacks and attack entry paths, but basic cyber hygiene solves like 99% of the problems without outrageous costs.
Yeah. I often read about password protection. And is this really enough, or are there also attacks on a deeper level that exploit system vulnerabilities?
That's a great question. So the password example is it's easier for me to speak about in the residential solar. Okay, so let's take a company that manages 1 million residential inverters in Europe, right? So there's a company somewhere that has all its back-end servers, and they communicate with all these inverters to get monitoring data and to do software updates. So this is like the infrastructure, right? It's a company, and then it connects to 1 million homes. And a lot of these endpoints, a lot of these homes can be accessed using a password, right? So an installer installs a system on my roof, and then if they want to change something, they just go, okay, my name, my birth date, boom, I'm in. And many installers, they don't want to complicate things. They want one password for all their customers. And then what happens is that if you know the password for one, you can start guessing what your password's neighbor is. And that's where it's like if you have too many copies of your key to your house, right? You don't want too many copies of your door to be running around the neighborhood or outside your neighborhood. So in those cases, passwords are very important to manage, to randomize, to have them very long, even though it's annoying to remember. But the good news are that there's a movement away from passwords, right? Like SolarEdge implemented a mechanism where there's no need to remember a password. You just scan a QR code and there's certificate exchange behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about it. So there are ways to get around that, but definitely, weak passwords are the number one reason for poor cyber hygiene. In the UK, a regulation passed last year called UK PSTI for any IoT device, any connected smart device, and they had 3 requirements. 2 of them were procedural, and the third was do not use default passwords. That's the one thing they required. And you keep seeing these reports of like how 90% of ransomware attacks on IoT devices are from weak passwords. If you look at a solar plant, it's less applicable because, again, if you have a firewall and there's somebody managing it, it's not really about passwords. It's about like strictly managed channels of access to strictly defined parties. So it's less about the passwords.
All right. What kind of hackers carry out attacks on PV systems? Are they professionals or just amateurs? Or and what are their goals? You mentioned a few before, but ransomware. But are there other goals?
Yeah. So the sad answer is we don't really know. I mean, there haven't been a lot of attacks. If you take other industries, retail, like there's not a week where you don't hear about some attack on a retail store somewhere.
Mm.
I think that in our segment, it's just starting. I could hypothesize on incentives and on identity of who might want to do it. I mentioned how critical criminal motivation is typically much more common um, and less covert than what a state actor might want to do. But whether the Russian Federation has an interest into penetrating and getting a grip on European power supply, that's a geopolitical question. Like it's a bit outside my kind of direct expertise. But the criminal motivations will always be there, and that is something that we just see. There's these graphs about the ransomware economy, and every year it's in the billions, and every year it's growing. I read somewhere that ransomware attacks have become a third of the source of foreign currency for North Korea, right? So that it's become a
Wow.
business, like a bad export business, where they would take a system ransom and then basically collect Bitcoin that they would exchange for foreign currency that they need. So it's a big industry, unfortunately, and you do see sometimes. I saw a report, for example. It's not really hacking, but it's close. In Romania, there was an incident where homeowners tinkered with their solar systems to like jailbreak to unlock the breaks in the inverter so that they can export, I think, in higher voltage or some manipulation that allows them to export more and make more money. But it's the distribution manager, the DSO, that really suffers from these types of manipulations. So you see everything from petty crime to organized cyber gangs. And sometimes these cyber gangs, it's amazing. I heard podcasts, they work like call centers. You have in some parts of the world, like office buildings with people that deploy these ready made kits on ransom, and you can call them and negotiate over the size of the payment that they want. This is a real thing that's been happening for years. Sometimes some countries endorse it, like countries that are outside of the kind of the global order. Um, so you have anything from petty crime to organized crime to state-sponsored attacks, um, but that is all, I guess, contextual. What we are actually seeing without hypotheses is more and more proofs of concept, and a few of these real world attacks that are attributed to Russian speaking cyber gangs, but who knows? I definitely don't know.
Mm. Uri, you're located in Israel. These are very difficult times. Israel is being attacked with bombs and missiles. Do you also notice cyber attacks on solar power plants as a means of warfare?
There's always, I call it background noise in the internet, right? There's these generic attacks that try and target companies and try and find ways to benefit from that. We cannot say that we've seen anything, in our industry or in our business specifically over the last year that's been outside of norm. So no, not quite.
As far as I know, you don't have a tech background. Is cybersecurity more about strategy than technology?
That's a great question. And I think it's more philosophical, right? I mean, I've worked in business consulting and with McKinsey for a few years, and one of the great lessons I took there was that yes, there's a great importance to subject matter expertise, but there's also a great advantage sometimes in coming into a problem space and into a domain, and look at it from a different altitude or a different perspective. So I personally think that a strategic mindset is relevant in many spaces, and it's not instead. It complements deep technical understanding, and I definitely consult a lot with the more technical folks. But I did work for a few years more deeply into the cyber industry, so I do have an intuition for some of the important points in attack and in defense of systems. But whether it's more about strategy is a great question. At the end of the day, I think the world is not about one technology or another. Technology can get complicated, but at the end of the day, things, how to say it, think in a way, things are simple. People try to do things to other people for reasons, and it can get very technical, but at the end of the day, it's all about people, at least until GPT and AI replace us all. But for now, I think most complex things happening in that space can be simplified to that, I believe.
Yeah. All right.
What do you think?
Yeah, very good answer. Yes, could be.
Could be.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll break off from my basic training was in history and philosophy and humanities, and I feel like it informs a lot of my thinking and understanding, just to kind of see how technology impacted societies throughout history, and how technological change affects things that go way beyond technology. So I always think with those mindsets and those prisms as well. And we're definitely going through fundamental changes all at once now, both with AI, both with social media and way that information is disseminated. And we spoke about this a little bit, right? TikTok compared to the old printing press and radio.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also how energy is distributed, right? Energy, we used to think about energy like it's something that the state needs to provide its citizens, right? Like we have big power plants, and the governments, they need to give us power, water, sewage, roads, communication. But increasingly, there is a change in that paradigm where I can buy a solar plant, I can buy a battery, and go off grid. I can manage my own energy more efficiently sometimes and more reliably. Depends on the weather and radiance and where you are in the world. But the technology that allows you to do that is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And you're also seeing a far greater role of free market companies, right? Enterprises. You and I can start in business tomorrow, develop land, build big power plants, become asset owners, investors, and become energy market players. And this was not possible 20, 30 years ago. To build even the smallest peaker plant or gas plant, you had to be some company. So new options are changing the sociology, the character, the dynamics of who's playing in this market, which I think is fascinating and is really changing some of the paradigms on who's responsible to protect this. Can a government require from 1 million households to secure their solar energy supply to the grid? We're not used to having that type of responsibility, over shared public domain. But I think there are ways to do it. We just need to break a little bit away from existing paradigms. And when I speak with regulators, I just say it, like we've seen power quality export to the grid as something that the government needs to regulate. Nobody is getting an interconnection permit if you're not completely up to spec. No OEM can connect their equipment if they're not entirely up to the power quality spec. But we've not looked in the past at things like fire safety or electrocution safety, but trial and error and bad experiences taught us that needs to be standardized. And what I think will happen next is, now that solar energy is becoming a big chunk of the energy mix, and now that cyber attacks are getting more common, and now that the world is becoming a bit more unstable, I think what will happen is that the government will intervene and say, okay, you want an interconnection permit? You need this, that, and that type of minimal security, which hopefully, exists, has been demonstrated to be applicable and not too costly. So this is not something that's going to make the technology much more expensive. And the example I always give is seatbelts in cars, right? 30, 40, 50 years ago, we had no seatbelts in cars. And for many years, car companies said, we don't need it. The numbers and the research is ambiguous. And I think it was Volvo that was first to say, hey, no, like we want to be responsible. People drive our cars. This is life and death. And they just put the seatbelts. And after a few years of that, the data was unequivocal. The survival rates and the safety rates are just much, much better. And then regulators sprung into action and said, hey, everybody needs to have it. So we're seeing a similar dynamic happen now with cyber risk that, some companies are saying, hey, we understand the risk. We're deploying all these systems that will pump power to the grid for the next 10, 15 years, which is the life cycle of the system. We're building a plant for 20 years. we want to make sure that we're getting it right now, because 5, 10, 12 years from now, who knows what world we'll be living in 2045, right? 20 years ago, 2005, we didn't even have Facebook, and now we're with GPT. So in 2045, who knows what the geopolitical realities will be? So you're seeing some asset owners already factor in that risk and make those basic investments that put them ahead of the pack. And sometimes being ahead of the pack is all you need, so that the bad guys go elsewhere. And hopefully, within a few years' time, regulators will say, okay, everybody needs to meet these minimal bars. Everybody needs a seatbelt. There's no such thing as a car without a seatbelt and a solar plant without a firewall, not even if you're a 1 megawatt site. And these are not crazy costs, right? You build a car, a seatbelt is 100 more euros, it's nothing. You save it on the insurance or the repair costs. And the same with solar plants. To put fire safety, to put a firewall, at the end of the day, will save you. To buy a more durable panel that will withstand hail or weather will, at the end of the day, save you money. So we're seeing some of the large asset owners already factor those types of risks into the ROI calculations of individual plants. But it's still not widespread, and we're having a lot of these discussions now that, because people are asking, they're aware vaguely of the risk, and they see regulation coming, like NIS2 and CRA, and they see all the wave of regulation coming, the network code on cybersecurity, to stick to your European context, but also in America and Australia. And they see it coming, so they start these discussions. Okay, how can I protect against it? But the solutions are not standardized and mature enough yet, if that makes sense.
Yes. A very good bridge to my next question. Solar Power Europe has just recently published a report called Solutions for PV Cyber Risks to Grid Stability. What are the main remedies for cyber attacks recommended by this report?
Right. So the report basically looked at how much energy is now being fed into the European grid, and compared that to various scenarios of grid instability. So if you take, for example, the Spanish blackout, and a great report by the authorities came out yesterday or 2 days ago. So the Spanish blackout was caused by a sudden change of 2.2 gigawatts. And just for proportion, the number of energy fed into the grid by solar inverters in Europe is around 200 gigawatts. So we are way past those critical thresholds. So in a way, what that report tried to say was, hey, look, we may not be the majority of the grid yet, but we are already at a stage where we need to own the responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility, and we are producing great power, we being the solar industry. So, and this is a solar industry saying, right? Typically, you would think that associations or industry would try to shy away from regulation and from saying that there's any risk. But no, this is counterintuitive. The industry rallied around this point saying, hey, look, we understand how this is built. We understand how easy the solutions are, but we also understand that there's government action needed. So there's a level playing field, and that there's a standard that everyone can meet together, not in different patchwork, but in a way that's like a strong chain without weak links in it. So the report by Solar Power Europe essentially says, hey, look, there's an issue. Here's a very detailed breakdown, which was done rigorously based on the official European grid model by ENTSO-E. And they've done the work, and they said, these types of things can happen. Here are the ways to solve against them. Here's what we're doing, but we want government to act too. And the good news are that the EU Commission sprung into action. I've been very impressed by the speed and by the level and depth of understanding by regulators in Europe of the issue. And they engaged in a very, very open way to get all the data, and the public consultation were open in the EU Commission and in other bodies, by the way, and also in member states. And there's risk assessments now underway that I think are planned to conclude early next year, with clear instructions on what the solution implementation roadmap should look like.
All right. And what are the main procedures, methods that are recommended for protecting against cyber attacks?
So I would say, cyber can seem very frightening and unclear. But what I've come to learn, being in this industry for almost a decade now, is that the basic things are the most important. The basic cyber hygiene. You will hear this term, basic cyber hygiene. I like to tell this story where I went to my dentist, and she's very accomplished. She's got 30 years of experience, and she told me this: look, I'm a professor in dentistry, and 90% of what I do in my day to day is teach people how to brush and floss right. Because at the end of the day, that's the main reason for cavities. And it's a good analogy, because at the end of the day, most cyber attacks you hear about, they're not, of course, not against the very fortified, banks, even though there's high motivation to breach. And they're also not against the just run-of-the-mill, basic cybersecurity protected company or business. 19 times out of 10, it'll be through an open door that somebody left to forget. It will be through a default password. It will be through a firewall that was not patched or upgraded so that an old vulnerability can be used to get in. And I'm now reminded that you asked me about passwords and vulnerabilities. If you want, I can answer that in a moment. But again, 19 times out of 10, it'll be something basic. So if you want to really make sure that your business is protected against the most significant types of risk, get a run-of-the-mill solution, get a consultancy to help you through risk reduction. And typically this would be something like, firewall, annual audit, biannual audit. Make sure that you have the basics in place if you're an asset owner. And if you're in like a residential or commercial size inverter, again, make sure that your password's protected, make sure that your device is up to date, it's patched. So
we'll come to that in a bit. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you. And the report also demands to limit remote access and control of EU solar PV systems from outside the EU via the inverter. What's the point of that? Where are most of the hackers located?
Well, I think a lot of the drive for that call was to say, okay, we being Europe, have managed the energy infrastructure in a way that was very controlled. So, 30 years ago, most of the European energy infrastructure was centralized power plants that had strict regulatory requirements about how they can export energy and how they were managed. And now what we're seeing the internet connect to all these plants. We're seeing cloud servers everywhere and interconnectivity by third-party providers that manage your trackers and manage your battery energy system, and they do all this smart management. And an asset owner company told me yesterday, battery plus storage is not a luxury. It's what you have to do to pass the profitability threshold today. So connectivity is not an option. You have to have a smart grid, and you have to have all these internet connections to your site. Where was I?
Where the hack is located and how it...
Okay. So the report is saying, hey, look, we've managed the European grid in a way that was very tightly controlled, but we're in a new world. We're in a world where energy is democratized. Energy is managed by markets. It's managed by people. So how do we maintain those principles of energy sovereignty, of having control in Europe, even in times of crisis? They say there, let's imagine there's a global communication crisis. There's an internet breakage and nobody can communicate outside of Europe. What do we do then? And they say we need to have data infrastructure and communication infrastructure, and at least the critical control infrastructure in Europe. So they're calling for various limitations and rethinking of what type of remote control can be allowed on power generating plants that are big enough, right? That are big enough to make a dent on the overall energy supply. So that's the main call, I would say.
I mean, doesn't such a restriction on access to inverters create problems in manufacturing and distribution, since the devices would once again need to be adapted regionally?
So yes, and one way to think about it, the easiest way for me, when the kids want to come in and out, and me and my wife go to work, the easiest way is to leave the door open. It's the easiest, right? And we've kind of gotten used to this. In the energy industry, it was a niche industry. It was a lifestyle thing, and everybody, vendors, everybody connected to everything. I was at a conference in Inter Solar in Munich a few months ago, and a tracker company comes to me and he came to my panel and he says, "Why is everybody disconnecting me from their power plants? It's really hurting our business." And they were living on the margin, I guess, of profitability. And all of a sudden, customers are saying, "Hey, we do not know you well enough to know how much we can trust your network. We don't know where you store the data, how you manage it. You're not certified for any of these fancy standards. So we're going to have to disconnect you until you finish all these procedures." So he came to better understand why this is happening. And this is part of a trend of saying, okay, you want to have access into my solar plant, you want to have access into energy infrastructure, you need to go through some basic vetting. You need to close the door. You need to have a key and hide it somewhere, to go back to my home's analogy. So yes, we're seeing some challenge. And from an example that I know close, right? If you're an OEM and you install inverters, then yes, some sites, typically we see this in like defense establishments, like a NATO base or a transmission station. So they have very strict security requirements. So they will say, hey, we want your product, but we will not connect it to the internet. Sometimes they allow a SIM card, like a disconnect, a separate connection. But sometimes they will say, we want nothing at all. We want a completely offline system. And there's ways to accommodate that, but you will certainly lose some of the benefits of having real live ability to monitor every panel and panel, whether there's dust on it, whether it broke because of a hailstorm or a branch fell on it. So yes, you lose some of the benefits of not having open doors, but I think those are insignificant. And in many of the cases, there are ways to secure smart connectivity. But it will definitely require a lot of industry players to shape up and do the basic minimum. It's a hassle to floss every evening, right? Sometimes you bleed, and sometimes, but it does prevent cavities.
Yes, definitely. You told me before that systems will need to be certified to achieve more cybersecurity in the future. Solar Power Europe and others are working on that. What is happening there? What can we expect in the future?
So we like to put it this way. We say, okay, if you want to secure these types of systems of millions of inverters, and I'm thinking about a home inverter now, you want four things. You want, number one, that the endpoint, the box, the inverter, which is the brain of any solar system, you want that to be secure. You want the Wi-Fi to be closed. You want the physical connectors to be disabled. You want it to have a password, etc. So you want to have a set of protections. That's the endpoint. Number two, you want the servers of the company that's controlling it. So this could be the OEM, this could be a VPP, this could be various other companies, but you want that server to be protected. And then you want to have the connection to be secure, because sometimes it's not a peer-to-peer connection. It's like a WhatsApp group. It's a lot of peers. You have the DSO, the VPP, the OEM. Everybody wants to control the inverter, right? The VPP wants to maximize on your battery. The OEM wants to send software updates. The DSO wants to have an emergency control, and there's many more. The installer wants to connect remotely, and the list goes on. There's at least 7 or 8 I can list you. So all these stakeholders want to have a management. So you need the endpoint, the servers, and the connection to be secure. Last and not least, you want to be able to trust every one of those entities to be someone that you allow that type of access to. So the good news are there are very good solutions, technical solutions for every one of these segments. We've seen great standards on how to secure a smart car, how to secure an ATM, right? You don't hear about a lot of ATMs being breached. So we can secure the boxes. We can secure when you want to, there's a way, right? So we can secure the inverters. Similarly, you can also secure the backend server. And here, again, you don't hear about a lot of bank robberies. We heard about it in the Wild West and the Western movies, but you don't hear about it today, even though all those systems are digital and oftentimes in the cloud, but they're well protected. And for the connection inside, again, you can think about payments. We can all move payments around in a way that's secure with a tap of a touch of a phone. So there are ways to secure it that are not too expensive, but they need to be standardized. And also, the trust, like who do you trust to manage this? Do you want any company that doesn't have to be registered anywhere, that could be operated like a straw man from North Korea? or you want to have some kind of basic vetting for who is managing big chunks of the grid. So in Solar Power Europe, we're saying, hey, let's make sure that all these 4 components in a row and then rock and roll. Not only that you're secure, you're much more secure than the current grid. And also, if whatever happens, a bad weather event or a power failure, the other parts of the systems are independent, they're distributed. And a distributed grid that has different generation sources, every house can sustain itself, every neighborhood, if the right network code is implemented, could protect itself, and every country could island itself and go into emergency mode, turn off a few of the big industrial plants, and boom, everybody can self-sustain just on the battery. So there are very optimistic visions, utopian visions of what a renewable-based digital grid can look like, kind of like online banking, right? I mean, 30 years ago, this would have been fantastic that you can just move digital money around. There's no fraud, there's no money laundering. Everything's documented in a central system. It's great. It's great for the economy. The same can happen for energy trading, which is going to make for a much more efficient grid. It doesn't make sense for electricity to cost the exact same all the time, day and night, regardless of consumption, regardless of demand, regardless of production and supply, in different parts of the country, parts that are remote and centralized. So we can make much more sophisticated and therefore efficient energy markets based on this digital grid. But if you don't want bad folks to take advantage and steal and manipulate these markets, you just have to take technologies that have been proven in other markets and bring them here and implement them here. So that's a long way to say Solar Power Europe, sees where this is going and wants this technology to the standardization process to start as early as possible so that we can get to 2030, 2040 and be pioneering in a renewable-based, clean, trusted, reliable, cybersecure grid.
All right.
Which I think is a cool vision. Exciting vision, yeah.
And when will we see some kind of certification for certain devices?
Okay, yeah. So when will we see certifications for this great future that I'm saying? So for some of it, we already have some of it here, right? So if you take the box, right, the inverter in a house solar system.
Yeah.
So first thing that you can do is just take IoT cybersecurity standard and say, hey, I want to match with that. There's standards. One, for example, ETSI 303645. If your vendor is compliant with that, that's great. You solve 95% of the problem. And a lot of these standards are going to be mandatory in Europe starting from when the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, is implemented, which is in a year or two. So that's one. The basic step is going to go up on some of the things. In America right now, there's 2 standards being developed specifically for power equipment, so specifically for residential PV inverters. One of them is UL 2941, and the other one is NIST 8498. So there is work being done to create the right standard for the inverters. For the servers, for the multi-stakeholder communications, there's other technologies that are being promoted. Australia is now doing a pilot for the multi-stakeholder communication based on something called PKI, which is public key infrastructure. It's the technology behind how you do DocuSign and internet type signatures that are trustable. So they use the same mechanism of trust to enable the multi-stakeholder deals or remote operations. And for backend servers, I mean, there's industries that have crazy certificates, right? You can go for banking, you can go for others, but there are definitely standards that we're calling to be adopted. And also for foreign ownership or things of that sort, to mention the 4th pillar.
All right. If I was an investor or even would like to build a PV power plant, what do I need to know about cybersecurity?
So to an investor, I would say this. You have 2 options. One is to say it won't hit me, and it might not. With risk calculations, it might be the case. I know that, for example, some investors and asset owners, they have this assumption of, okay, in the 20-year lifetime, what is the chance of an extreme weather event and what's the downtime? And based on that, they make decisions on the quality and the endurance and durability of the panels and inverters and protections. So that's a calculation that they make. So let's say, if you're an investor and there's no regulation saying you need any fire safety or physical safety like fences Nobody's requiring it from you. Today, typically, it's the financing partners or the insurance that say, if you want insurance for your plants, you need to have a fence, you need to have security camera, and the O&M company need to maintain it through some kind of security control room. So it's a no-brainer, right? It's within the process. It's part of the insurance. But let's imagine this wasn't required, and you're an investor. Do you want to have a fence? Do you want to have security cameras? Do you want to have those protections? That's I don't know, an economic decision. If I decide to take the maximum car insurance or not take theft insurance, that's a risk decision I'm making. And today we're in a place where there is not mandated requirements for asset owners or financing partners or insurers to have that. We may have it in a few years. It may be imposed retroactively. But if you want
to, you mean what you mean is protection against cyber cyber
yes.
attacks. Oh,
thanks
right.
for thanks for connecting me to the ground. But yes, if you're an asset owner and you want to make sure that in the next 20 years you reduce the chance of a cyber attack, then yes, you should look into it. And there are a few basic steps you can do to make sure that you're compliant with the Purdue model topology or that you have secure firewalls. And anyone's welcome to reach out who's heard this podcast, and I'm happy to give advice on what else can be done. But if you want to reduce the risk, just be ahead of the curve. Don't wait for this to become mandatory, and find some source of advice on how to do it. My assumption is that within a few years' time, we will see this start either through interconnection requirements or from insurance and financing partner risk reduction requirements. And I say this because we see a lot of interest from them. They come and they look for this type of advice. They engage in Solar Power Europe discussions to get this type of information. And again, you don't need to build a Fort Knox around your asset. Typically, you just need something very minimal. And one joke I like to say about this is that I heard this in a trip, in a safari trip. So two friends are walking in a forest, and suddenly they see a lion. So one of them starts running, and the other one ducks down and starts tying its shoelaces. So the running friend says, "Hey, buddy, you're not going to outrun the lion. Why are you bothering?" And he says, "I don't need to outrun the lion. I need to outrun you." So, it's a sad truth, but typically attackers go for the point of least resistance, the path of least resistance. And for asset owners and investors that want to be ahead of the curve, sometimes you only have to have slightly higher walls for the attackers to say, okay, I'm going to go that way. That is definitely not my call to the public. My call to the public would be, let's make sure that we all raise the walls. Let's make sure that we find ways to kick them out, to protect them, to counter-hack them, to do all these things, which really are the role of government. And that's what I tell government in our regulatory engagement. But to asset owners at this point, until government acts, and it will act, I think for an asset owner, make sure your house make sure your home is protected, make sure your family is protected, make sure that your assets are up to par and they at least have the minimal cyber hygiene requirements.
So if I get you right, there are no basic differences for investors of large-scale solar systems and maybe homeowners or even owners of balcony solar systems that have also been hacked, I think, or are there differences? What would you say?
So balcony solar, I think it's a very quote-unquote dumb device. So there's not a lot of computational power. You put it in the socket. I don't think there's a lot more going on, but definitely for residential solar, there's a concern. I think, if you think about it, a residential inverter or a commercial inverter is like taking a big solar plant and cramming it in a box. It's to those who lived in the 80s, there was this American movie called Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, right? So if you've seen it, but if you take a solar field, right, you have the inverters, you have the SCADA controller, you have the gateway. And if you take all that and you shrink it into an inverter, then within a shoebox, you have the modem, which is the gateway. You have the CPU, which is the SCADA. You have the FPGAs and power conversion technology, which is like the inverters. So everything is in one. So I think if you're a homeowner or a business owner that's concerned about cyber, the best thing you can do is just do the research, find the best vendor that you feel comfortable with for a cybersecure box, right? So you can trust the box, you can trust the backend servers, you can trust the encryption in between, and you're good for that. and obviously I have an interest in this is I'm cyber program director at SolarEdge. But if you are a solar plant operator, and in that area we have no business, so I'm really trying to give, in both cases, I'm trying to give the best objective advice. But if you are a solar plant operator, and you want to, again, your question was how to protect, right, against.
What are the differences between large scale solar
Right.
systems and residential?
Okay, so I would say this: in the large scale or the ground mount fields, if you're a 75, 100 megawatt plant owner, I'm pretty sure somebody's already spoken to you, right? Those sites are typically treated with gloves of silk. I've heard this from across industry. But if I pulled out the data a little while ago, in Europe, I think 30% of the sites are 5 to 25 megawatts, and 20% are 25 to 75 megawatts or 100. So there's a lot in between. The majority of sites are in between in this range that is not regulated. In America, by the way, it's different. In America, 60% of the solar plants are above 100 megawatts. So they have mega plants. So the situation we're seeing in Europe is less big plants and more small plants spread out. It's much more distributed. So the typical investor, the typical asset owner in Europe will have in its portfolio 5, 10, 20 megawatt sites under their portfolio. And those sites are typically not regulated. So it's really about the best practices that the EPC or that the O&M company choose to have, or the requirements that are already there. And by the way, there are requirements on cyber that we just take for granted, like firewalls and VPNs, static IP addresses. Those we do see kind of as a basic baseline already. Not everywhere. Some cases are terrible, but we do see those. And those requirements are I think, are only going to grow. So the difference is, trying to tie back into your question, that if you're in a residential or commercial, you just want to make sure that your vendor of the box of the inverter is something you're comfortable with. But if you're in a solar site, it's a slightly more complex issue because there aren't regulation, there aren't standards. We just gave a presentation to the EU Commission recently saying, hey, there's this middle segment, which is big in Europe, of mid-sized solar plants, which is Wild West. And we need to regulate this. Yes, it's not the West, but it's wild. And until we regulate this, which could take 1, 2, 3 years, I don't know, for it to roll out, I would say asset owners, investors, if you want to be on the safe side, just go fix it. Go find a consultancy that knows its stuff about cyber. I can refer you to a few that I have no business interest with, but we can connect you to, and they'll give you the advice.
Do you have a price tag for this? How much does it cost to
Not a lot. Yeah, I haven't factored it, but I do for residential, right? So let's say, I don't want to give exact numbers because I'm not sure, but a company like SolarEdge has many hundreds of power engineers. The cyber team is not that big, it's a handful of experts. And a handful of experts can just go into early product design stage and say, hey, let's take those things into consideration. Hey, let's make sure these doors are locked. Hey, let's do this. And if you do that and you pull expertise and precedents from other industries, you can do it pretty lightweight. And then, and I had to say this to the EU Commission, one of the bodies in the EU Commission once, because they said, hey, look, if we require high cyber level, will this hurt competitiveness? Will this hurt the jobs of installers? Will this make the installation too costly for the market to continue? And we did the numbers, and it was almost negligible. So if you want some numbers, you put a solar system on your roof, it would be 10 to 20,000 euros in most European countries, right? Depending on the size, etc. The inverter out of that is 10%. And to make the inverter more cyber secure for a company who makes millions of inverters is typically a few software definitions. So this is really negligible. It's not even in the single euro. So we did the numbers and we told the government representative, we said, hey, look, we ran the number. Here's the model. You can analyze it yourself. This has zero impact. This is just like the car seatbelt. It has zero impact. And I know that you have a lot of listeners that are investors and asset owners. So to them, I would say it's kind of the same. At the end of the day, inverters, I saw numbers once in a utility setting, it's about 3% of the total cost because they have the development and they have the wires and the panels and the work and the maintenance and the OPEX. And so from the overall cost, the inverter would be 3%. So, having a more secure inverter. It's not just the inverter, right? In a utility setting, you need to have firewalls, you need to have some kind of basic maintenance. I don't want to give numbers, but I've heard some O&M companies saying this is less than 0.5% of the OPEX. I've seen some EPCs say this is a one-time CapEx investment that we make, and then you have the protection later on. But it's close to negligible is what I would say. And it would be at the same par as what you're already spending on fire protection, or probably less than theft protection.
Very good. So very affordable also. Last question. Is cybersecurity already sufficiently on the radar of system operators, as we talked about, or will we soon see spectacular hacks that will raise awareness of this issue?
I definitely hope not. I hope this is one of the issues that gets solved before anything happens. And it's doable, right? A lot of these systems can be secured. If you're asking about if it's on the radar, it is. I mean, if you look at the report by Red Electrica, right, about the Spanish blackout, I mean, just look at the news. An hour after the Spanish blackout happened, everybody was sure that it's a cyber attack. And ENISA, the European Agency for Cyber Resilience, they issued out within the day an announcement saying, hey, it's not a cyber attack. No need to worry. We're not under some kind of... But in people's minds, because we have seen so many attacks on businesses, on co-ops, on retail stores, that I think it's reached a point where people understand this is a part of our life now. And this is a type of crime and of piracy that is going to be around. And if you ask about TSOs, yes, I know for a fact we speak with ENTSO-E quite a bit. They're perhaps the most concerned with grid devices that they don't see, that they don't control, and they understand deeply what was written in the DNV report. So, these understandings, it starts with awareness, and then it takes a few years until it translates into hard regulations and hard permitting requirements. There's often a grace period, and those things move slow. But they're moving, and there's great determination to make sure that the minimal protections and then more advanced protections are being put in place. So I would bet with pretty high confidence that we're a few years away from having these things standardized and required. And at that point, I think we'll be in a better place where asset owners don't need to think too hard. They have boxes to tick. The insurers and financiers ask for whatever they ask for. There's going to be a mature industry, I hope, at this point that knows how to serve these needs. And hopefully we'll be in a much more secure place.
Uri, thank you so much for these interesting insights into cybersecurity, and thank you for being on the Solar Investors Guide podcast.
Karsten, it was a pleasure. Every time I get a chance to have such an in-depth conversation, it's fun for me. I hope these messages get out to people who are interested, who can use them to make our power system more secure. And again, Solar Power Europe is always open to visitors and to new members, and I'm personally available and interested in substantive conversations with anyone who wants to follow up.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That was the Solar Investors Guide podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. But even if not, please feel free to drop me a line. I am also happy to receive ideas for topics, questions, and other suggestions. My email address is schäfer@photovoltaic.eu. And if you don't want to miss any more investors topics, visit our website at photovoltaic.eu/investors and sign up for our newsletter. You can also find the link and all other information in the show notes to this podcast.